How about we focus on neglect dyslexia next? One thing I wanted to mention with some of the ones that we've talked about before, but I didn't bring up, is that these are things that we're noticing in other languages aside from just English. For example, Hebrew, Arabic, and Turkish. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but the letter position dyslexia also had Italian and Arabic.
Yes.
So this isn't something that we're seeing that just happens in English and it's an English only problem.
That's right. It happens in languages that are spelled alphabetically. So English, Italian, Spanish, French, they all use an alphabet, the same alphabet, the Roman alphabet. And so any of these problems will come up in any of those languages that use the Roman alphabet. Or if they use another alphabet such as Russian, which is also uses an alphabet, though it's not the English alphabet, or Greek, which uses a third alphabet, the Greek alphabet. So all of these will come up in all of those cultures. But of course, there are very interesting questions about what dyslexia is like in Chinese, which isn't written, which doesn't have letters, or in Japanese, which has 4 different writing systems. We won't talk about those today, but it is important to focus on the fact that all I'm talking about today is what goes wrong if you're reading an alphabetic system like all the European systems, either the Roman alphabet or the Greek alphabet or the Russian alphabet.
Right. Yeah. So when we're talking about neglect dyslexia, that's where the attention isn't distributed equally across all of the letters when you're reading a word or a pseudo word.
Yes, and you can tell that by giving a child a word like, let's say, trip, T-R-I-P. If a child reads that as grip, G-R-I-P, then they're not paying attention to the very first letter, and that's the sign of attentional dyslexia. You need to use words like trip and grip where there are 2 possibilities in one position. And so if you give a child a word like, I'm making this up now, but clap, for instance, if there's no other word ending LAP, then the child can figure out, well, it's LAP, so I suppose it's clap. But trip and grip, you can't do that. And so yet again, and this is a lesson we'll be going over, pay attention to the errors that the child makes. And if they're only on the first letter, then that's attentional dyslexia. So instead of reading trip as trap, they never do that, but they might read trip as grip, then their problem is specific to the first letter. And that's what neglect dyslexia is. They're neglecting the first letter.
Dr. Coulthart, may I ask a quick question about that?
Yes.
And I noticed, of course, in your PowerPoint that you talk about instructional casualties. And so we know how teachers are prompting kids to attack an unknown word, certainly wires their brain differently. And so attentional dyslexia, of course, is when kids are making an error on the first letter, but likely if they've been taught in prompts to look at the first letter and guess, could that mirror the same thing, I guess? I'm wondering about that.
Well, it certainly will produce, it's certainly a bad way to teach reading, of course, because it's very difficult to guess words from context. And so if you're teaching the child, well, get the first letter, T, and then look at the context for the rest of the sentence. This is a good experiment that anybody can do at home. Get the newspaper and cross out every 4th word, and then show it to a friend of yours and ask them to read it with every fourth word crossed out. Now, you've got lots of context there because 3/4 of the words are still there. It's very, very difficult to read. So there's much less effective context than we think. If there was a lot of effective context, then missing out 1/4 of the words by blacking them out, you'd be able to figure out what they are. But you can see for yourself, as soon as you do this experiment, how poor context is. And so teaching children to rely on context is a bad idea because that's not going to help them learn to read. And so the general principle of look at the first letter and then guess from context, that's a bad approach. That's teaching children how not to read.
Definitely. And then neglect dyslexia can also occur at the sentence level too.
Yes. And so you might find if you give the child a sentence to read, they might neglect the first word in the sentence. And if the first word is an unimportant word like the, then you might think, well, they've still got the meaning. They've just left out an unimportant word. So you need sentences where the first word is something really important, like trees are used for shelter by birds. If you don't get the word trees, you have no idea what that sentence is about. And so the way to look at this is to give children sentences like that. You don't need to give them very many, and see whether they miss a word. And if it's a word, do they always miss the first word? And then if they do, you've pinned down exactly what's wrong with this particular child, and that's going to direct you towards appropriate interventions.
Right.